Hundreds of subjugated worlds heard it. In dusty market squares on desert planets, the signal was picked up on old comm units. In orbital habitats under Drathel guns, technicians secretly downloaded the data packets. On agricultural worlds that served as breadbaskets for the Empire, farmers listened. For the first time, they had a choice. A real one. Not the Drathel's false choice of submit or die. A choice to resist without launching a single missile. A choice to protect themselves. For the first time, they had a tool. Not a weapon of revenge, but a tool of sovereignty. The Empire, built entirely on fear, now faced a galaxy that was learning quickly how to defend itself. Their greatest weapon, the terror they could inflict from orbit, was becoming obsolete. A planet that could reliably swat down incoming bombers was no longer a target. It was a fortress. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The Drathel terror campaigns lost their potency. The image of invincibility cracked. The war was no longer just about humanity responding to an attack on Proxima Centauri. It was no longer a bilateral conflict. It was about everyone the Drathel had ever oppressed. It was about providing them with the means to say no. The battlefields multiplied from a few star systems to every corner of the galaxy, where a species decided to build a defensive grid and reclaim its space. The Empire wasn't fighting an enemy. It was fighting an idea, and ideas are very hard to kill. Human strategy shifted. The objective was no longer direct confrontation. The goal became systemic fragility. We did not need to destroy their empire to dominate the conflict. We needed to disrupt the invisible machinery that made their domination possible, to find the critical pressure points and apply precisely measured force. The goal was not annihilation. It was dissolution. The infrastructure that sustained 12 millennia of Drathel rule was a complex, deeply interconnected web. Control networks that managed fleets across sectors, automated supply chains that moved resources from conquered worlds to forge new warships, communication relays that carried orders from the core worlds to the far frontiers. This system was their true strength. It was also their greatest vulnerability. They had built an empire that ran on autopilot, governed by rigid protocols and unquestioned hierarchies. It was a machine that had forgotten how to think for itself. We targeted the seams where the pieces joined. The misaligned incentives between regional governors and central command. The automated logistics protocols that ran without a single conscious thought. We introduced chaos into the clockwork. The first cracks appeared not in their fleet but in their territory. Formerly subjugated worlds, now armed with defensive blueprints and a newfound sense of possibility, began declaring independence. Their chains were breaking not by our hand, but by their own will, enabled by the tools we provided. They didn't need to win a war. They just needed to quietly stop participating in the Empire's economy. They rerouted their resource shipments. They ignored mobilization orders. They shut down the Imperial comm relays on their worlds. This was not a rebellion of soldiers. It was a secession of systems. The effects were immediate and cascading. Drathel supply chains, which depended on flawless coordination across light years, began to fracture. A battleship waiting for deuterium fuel in one system would find its shipment had been redirected by a local governor who no longer recognized imperial authority. A munitions factory on an industrial world would go silent because the rare earth metals from a mining colony never arrived. The machine was seizing up. Command structures faltered. Orders from the core worlds became suggestions, then pleas, then echoes in the void. The certainty of the chain of command evaporated. This strategic erosion had a profound psychological impact. Their commanders, stationed on mighty warships that were suddenly low on fuel and munitions, began to question the regime. The fear that had glued the Empire together started to work in reverse. If the central authority could not keep the lights on, could not ensure a steady supply of food and fuel, then what was the point of loyalty? What was the benefit of fear? They had signed up to be the masters of the galaxy, not glorified security guards for a failing corporation. The myth of inevitability was replaced by the reality of systemic failure. The philosophy guiding our actions was precision over spectacle. It was a fundamentally different calculus of power. Why waste missiles and lives destroying a warship when you can achieve a better outcome by making its crew question the orders they're receiving? Why shatter a planet's surface when you can break its loyalty to a distant, crumbling throne by offering it the means to defend itself? The goal was always to preserve what could be saved and to dismantle only what was necessary. The Drathel Empire was not being defeated in a grand final battle. It was being methodically, carefully unmade from the inside out, piece by piece, connection by connection. It was dying not with a bang but with a slow, grinding sigh of obsolescence. The heresy began not with a shout, but with a quiet statement of fact. Battlegroup Commander Krath stood before his peers on the flag bridge of the lead ship. The tactical display showed a galaxy bleeding red, supply lines severed, former tributary worlds glowing with the defiant yellow of independence. His certainty, the bedrock of a 30-cycle military career, was gone. Shattered. He looked at the other commanders, their expressions a mix of anger, confusion, and dawning fear. He spoke the words that would unravel everything. "We are not losing because humans are stronger." The silence in the room was heavier than a heidong. He let it hang there. He had their full, horrified attention. They have no fleet that can match ours. Their weapons are primitive. Their technology in most measurable ways is inferior. He was stating facts they all knew, facts that made their current situation impossible. We are losing because for all our supposed superiority, we built an empire on a foundation of fear. He gestured at the tactical map, at the crumbling network of control. Fear is a brittle foundation. It works only as long as the threat is absolute and the obedience is total. The moment a crack appears, the whole structure begins to fail. The humans did not attack our ships first. They attacked our foundation. They gave our subjects a choice. They gave them a tool. Fear cannot compete with hope. It cannot withstand the idea of a better way. This was the core of the heresy. He was redefining their failure. It wasn't a military defeat. It was a systemic collapse. Surrender was not a failure, he continued, his voice gaining a strange, calm strength. It was a recognition, a logical conclusion. Our system is unsustainable. It demands constant expansion, constant subjugation, constant fear. It is a machine that must devour to survive. Eventually it runs out of things to eat. Or the food learns to fight back. The humans have simply accelerated the inevitable. They showed us the math, and the math does not lie. This brutal, logical honesty became a refrain. It spread through their ranks not as a rallying cry, but as a sober assessment. Commanders on other ships, staring at their own failing supply reports and receiving silence from high command, began repeating it. Officers whispered it in mess halls. The humans were not just fighting a war of attrition. They were offering an alternative, a path out of the endless cycle of conquest and fear. They offered a future where power wasn't measured by the ability to destroy, but by the capacity to build and protect. It was a vision that, once seen, could not be unseen. The Drathel were not losing a war in the traditional sense. They were losing the argument for their own existence. Their soldiers, the very instrument of their power, were starting to agree with the opposition. The battlefield had shifted completely. It was no longer a struggle over territory or resources. It was a moral and strategic redefinition of what a galactic civilization could be. The humans had changed the victory condition, and by that new metric, by the quiet, logical assessment of a battle group commander who had seen the truth, we were already winning. The Empire was dying from a question it could not answer. The nadir arrived at Karak Prime, the Overlords' central command. The heart of their power, a mantled world encased in orbital fortresses and layered defense grids. It was the symbol of their unshakable rule, the brain of their empire. The final, most hardened stronghold. A surgical strike was planned. Not an invasion, not an annihilation. The objective was devastation, but devastation with precision. A controlled demolition of their command structure. The target was infrastructure, not civilians. The goal was decapitation, not destruction. We aimed for the nerve centers, the command hubs, the data cores housing millennia of imperial doctrine, the orbital shipyards where new dreadnoughts were assembled, the communication arrays that held the fraying empire together. The strike was not designed to kill populations. It was designed to sever connections, to isolate, to paralyze. The plan was to leave the body of their civilization alive but remove its brain. The attack did not come as a fleet engagement. It came as a wave of targeted, hyper-advanced munitions and EMP bursts, calibrated to bypass defensive screens. It was over in minutes. From the outside, Karak Prime still hung in space, its cities glowing, its atmosphere intact, but the view from the inside was chaos. The mantled planet fractured along its administrative and logistical lines. Its fate was bifurcated. The leadership caste was shattered. Their secure bunkers breached not by explosives but by data-scrambling pulses that wiped their systems and severed their links to the outside. The military command hierarchy dissolved into 1,000 isolated pockets, each cut off from the others. The civilian infrastructure, however, remained largely untouched. Power grids stayed online. Life support hummed. The population was confused, frightened, but alive. The message was chillingly lucid. It was a statement of capability and intent, delivered not in words but in action. We could have killed you all. We possessed the targeting data and the firepower to crack the planet open, to reduce their capital to a cloud of dust and memories. We chose not to. We demonstrated that power could be redirected, that overwhelming force could be applied with the delicacy of a scalpel, not the brutality of a hammer. The purpose was control. The goal was to end the war, not to enact revenge. The objective was to create the conditions for rebuilding, not to leave a smoldering ruin as a monument to victory. The immediate aftermath was systemic collapse. With Karak Prime's command authority severed, the remaining Imperial structure lost its cohesion. Over 1,000 warships across the galaxy, suddenly cut off from orders and logistical support, were reduced to uncoordinated chaos. Fleet commanders became warlords claiming sectors for themselves. Regional governors declared independence. The monolithic Drathal Empire did not fall in a single glorious battle. It dissolved. It fragmented into a messy, contentious patchwork of rival states, neutral zones, and fledgling independent systems, all fighting over the pieces of the old order. The Drathal were not conquered in the traditional sense. They were not subjugated. They were released, freed from the rigid, suffocating system they had built for themselves, forced to confront a galactic reality where they were just one power among many. The cage door was opened and the Predator was led out into a world it no longer understood. In the shattered aftermath, a new voice took the lead. Not a general, not a diplomat, a criminal psychologist. Her name was Renata Okafor. She stepped into the hushed negotiation chamber on the neutral station. Her presence was a statement in itself. The war was over. Now came the far more complex work of peace. She did not negotiate from a position of subjugation. She negotiated for accountability. Her tools were not treaties and borders, but behavioral models and systemic analysis. The Drathal delegation expected punishment. They were braced for vengeance. Their entire culture was built on the principle that the victor extracts a price. They expected to become the conquered, to be stripped of assets, forced into servitude, their ships confiscated, their worlds occupied. They had prepared for humiliation, for the boot on their neck. It was the only outcome their history had ever produced. Okafor laid out 3 paths: a radical values-driven transition, a menu of futures, each with its own costs and requirements. There was no default option, no hidden trap. The choices were stark, clear, and completely unprecedented. Option 1 was total independence with heavily guarded borders. A clean separation. The Drathal remnant states would be left entirely to their own devices, isolated from the new galactic community, responsible for their own survival and rebuilding. A hard, lonely road. Option 2 was supervised integration, partial disarmament of their remaining fleet under a joint military command. A probationary period monitored by mixed species oversight committees. They would retain a degree of autonomy, but operate within a strict framework of rules and transparency. A middle path of managed transition. Option 3 was the most radical. Full partnership, immediate inclusion in the emerging galactic accord, but with a mandated program of reparative engagement. This meant Drathal engineers and resources would be tasked with helping to rebuild the worlds they had damaged. Their scientists would share technology freely. Their culture would open itself to external study and exchange. It was an offer of belonging, but it demanded a full public accounting of their past. Her mantra defined the entire process. She said it calmly, repeatedly, whenever the Drathal representatives bristled at the terms. "We don't want revenge." She let that hang in the air. "Revenge is inefficient. It is a circular transaction. It solves nothing. It builds nothing. We want transformation." This wasn't idealism. It was presented as a practical engineering problem. You have a broken system. These are the tools and processes available to fix it. Choose which set you prefer. This cold, clinical approach was the ethical spine of the new order. It was a complete redefinition of what victory meant. Power was not to be used for domination. It was to be applied as a force for reform. The goal was not to create a new hierarchy with humans at the top. The goal was to engineer a system where equal power was achieved through mutual accountability and verifiable trust. It was architecture, not conquest. The overlords, the surviving commanders, the planetary governors, they were all offered a choice. A real one, not an ultimatum, not a demand. A selection of possible futures, each with concrete terms and measurable outcomes. It was something they had never, in 12,000 years of galactic rule, given to anyone else. The act of offering a choice was, in itself, the most powerful demonstration of the new paradigm. They were being treated not as defeated monsters to be caged, but as rational actors capable of choosing their own fate. The shock of that respect was more disarming than any threat could ever be. The new Galactic Accord was immediately tested. It happened at Nexus Station, the neutral ground chosen for the first multi-species assembly. The tension was a physical thing in the air, thick and electric. Delegates from 100 worlds moved through the concourses, their interactions stiff, formal, heavy with 12,000 years of unhealed wounds. The Drathel contingent was small, heavily guarded. They kept to themselves, their body language a mix of imperial pride and new unfamiliar vulnerability. They were living symbols of the old regime, and everyone knew it. Then the attack came. Gavik's resistance fighters, their species had been among the first conquered, among the most brutally subjugated. Their hatred was not theoretical. It was a generational fire. They bypassed station security using methods perfected under occupation. Their target was the Drathel delegation lead. Their weapons were not energy-based. They were projectile, simple, brutal, effective at close range. Old hatreds flared in that moment, raw and immediate. The cycle of violence, seemingly broken, threatened to restart right there on the polished station deck. 3 human security personnel reacted. Their training was supposed to be for show. A formality. They were there as observers, not active participants. They saw the Gaviks move. They saw the weapons clear jackets. They saw the Drathel delegates frozen, completely unprepared for an attack in what they had been told was a secure venue. The humans did not hesitate. They moved. Not to return fire, not to tackle the attackers. They placed their own bodies between the Gaviks and their targets. They became living shields. The projectiles meant for copper skin struck human body armor. The impact was violent. 2 went down wounded. The 3rd stayed upright, covering the Drathel as station security finally swarmed the Gaviks. The aftermath was a different kind of silence. The shocked quiet of a paradigm violently broken. The Gaviks were disarmed, detained. Medics tended to the wounded humans. The Drathel delegates stood unharmed, surrounded by the humans who had just taken fire for them. Their expressions were unreadable, a storm of confusion, shame, and something that might have been the first flicker of trust. General Jackson arrived on the scene. His face was grim. He looked at the wounded guards, then at the Gaviks being led away, then at the Drathel. His response to the assembled press and delegates was not one of condemnation for the Gaviks. It was a statement of principle. Because if we allow violence now, he said, his voice cutting through the murmur, we prove the overlords were right all along. He let that hang in the air. The brutal logic of it settled over the room. That power is the only law in the galaxy. That the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. We are trying to build something different. It was a rejection of the entire foundation of the old order. It declared that the new law would not be written in blood, but in restraint. Protection of the vulnerable, even the vulnerable who were your former enemies, became non-negotiable. It was framed not as an act of charity, but as an essential component of lasting peace, a practical necessity. You cannot build a stable system if the losing side lives in constant fear of reprisal. Restraint, the conscious choice not to use your power even when you easily could, was defined as the new strength, the highest form of power. The creed for the new era was set in that moment, amid the scent of ozone and antiseptic. Something better was possible, but it wasn't inevitable. It wouldn't build itself. It required a conscious, difficult choice. It required choosing that better path every single time, especially when every instinct screamed for the older, simpler logic of vengeance. The economic and cultural crises demanded a solution. Vast swathes of the galaxy lay in ruin, their economies shattered by centuries of imperial extraction. Famine threatened entire sectors. Infrastructure was crumbling. The Drathel remnants were bankrupt, their war machine stilled, their people facing a future with no purpose beyond survival. A simple peace treaty would not be enough. The wounds were too deep, the imbalances too severe. Something more ambitious was required. A galactic Marshall Plan was initiated. The name was an old human historical reference, but the concept was adapted for a multi-species reality. It was not punitive. It was not designed to punish the Drathel or keep them weak. The framework was symbiotic, interconnected. Its primary goal was rapid, widespread stabilization. The secondary goal was to forge new bonds out of the rubble of the old ones. Drathel engineers, the very minds who had once designed planet cracker warheads and efficient orbital bombardment patterns, were given new assignments. They were paired with teams from worlds they had once helped subjugate. They were deployed not as conquerors, but as partners. They were tasked with restoring ecosystems poisoned by industrial runoff from imperial factories. They worked to rebuild power grids and water purification plants on worlds their own policies had left barren and thirsty. They used their renowned technical precision not for destruction, but for creation. It was a form of psychological and practical reparations, a way to literally rebuild trust, one structure, one cleared field at a time. A former Drathel senior engineer, a male named Gex, was interviewed on a progress report broadcast. He stood in a newly green field on a world his own designs had once helped glass. He was not apologetic. He was reflective, almost surprised. He said, "We spent centuries taking from this world. We measured its value only in what we could extract from it. Its minerals, its labor, its strategic position. Now we have learned to give back. To measure its value by its health, its ability to sustain life. It is not unpleasant." The statement was simple, devoid of grand emotion, but it captured the spirit of the entire endeavor. It was a quiet, profound shift in fundamental values. The program's core emphasis was on shared knowledge and technology transfer, not one-way aid. Drathel engineers shared their advanced material science to help rebuild stronger, but human and Gavix logisticians taught them new, efficient methods of resource management and sustainable design. Education exchanges were mandatory. Young Drathel studied on other worlds. Students from a dozen species attended newly opened academies on former Drathel core worlds. The flow of information was reversed. For millennia, knowledge had flowed inward toward the Empire. Now it radiated outward to everyone. The resolution of the plan was its foundational logic. The goal was to create deep structural interdependence, not a new form of dependency. The old power dynamics of master and servant, extractor and extracted, could not be allowed to re-emerge. The solution was to make every species, including the Drathel, materially and culturally invested in the success of the new galactic community. Their economies had to become interwoven. Their futures had to become mutually assured. If one sector prospered, all would benefit. If one faltered, all would feel the strain. This created a powerful practical incentive for cooperation that went beyond idealism. Power itself was being redefined by the program's very structure. It was no longer measured by what you could extract from others. It was measured by what you could contribute to the whole. Your value was your ability to build, to heal, to share. The most powerful being in the new galaxy was not the one with the most warships. It was the one who could help the most people. Identity became the galaxy's most contested terrain. The shooting had stopped. The rebuilding was underway. But the real work, the internal psychological work, was just beginning. Everyone had to renegotiate their place after millennia of a fixed, brutal hierarchy. The Drathel had defined themselves universally as masters. Their culture, their art, their religion, their very sense of self was built around the concept of innate superiority and the right to rule. The Gavix had been defined, both by the Drathel and by their own survival mechanisms, as slaves. Their history was a narrative of endurance under oppression. Their heroes were those who quietly preserved their culture in the shadows. The Traxians saw themselves as subjects. Pragmatic survivors who traded some autonomy for a measure of safety under the imperial umbrella. These were not just political positions. They were identities. They were the stories these species told themselves about who they were. And those stories had just ended. The vacuum was terrifying. Who were they without the Empire to define them? The Drathel faced a crisis of purpose. The Gavix faced the challenge of moving from resistance to governance. The Traxians had to decide if their pragmatism was a strength or a moral failing. This was where the most subtle, difficult conflicts emerged. Not over resources or borders, but over meaning. Humans had a paradoxical advantage here. We had never defined ourselves in relation to the Overlords. They arrived late in our story. Our identity was already a complicated mess of contradiction, curiosity, and stubborn independence. We had no historical baggage with them, no deep cultural wounds from their conquest. We could look at the situation with a clinical detachment the other species couldn't manage. This allowed us to serve as mediators, not by imposing solutions but by facilitating conversations. We created neutral forums, historical reconciliation panels, cultural exchange programs, joint educational initiatives. We didn't tell the Gaviks how to feel about the Drathel. We provided a secure space for them to articulate that rage, and for the Drathel to hear it, often for the first time. We didn't tell the Drathel what their new role should be. We asked them what skills and knowledge they possessed beyond warfare and administration. We forced everyone to look inward. Ambassador Ortiz noted in her later memoirs that our primary role shifted from military strategists to psychological facilitators. We helped others rediscover and reimagine themselves. We provided the mirrors, but they had to do the looking. The resolution was a gradual, painful, but profound shift. Dignity was found in new forms of strength. A Drathel engineer, once celebrated for the efficiency of his orbital bombardment patterns, found a deeper respect from his peers when he designed a water reclamation system that saved a famine-stricken world. His strength was no longer in dominance but in his character and intellect applied to creation. A Gaviks artist, whose work had been secretly circulated as acts of defiance, was now commissioned to create a monument for the new Galactic Council. Her community's strength was rediscovered in its cultural resilience and its ability to create beauty from pain. Power was systematically decoupled from conquest. It was slowly, painfully rediscovered in the quieter, more durable foundations of culture, cooperation, and shared purpose. The most powerful being in the sector was no longer the one with the most warships. It was the historian who could bridge two conflicting narratives, the engineer who could turn a weapon factory into a hospital, the farmer who could teach soil renewal techniques to a former overlord. The battlefield of identity was never going to be completely peaceful. But the weapons used there were no longer bombs. They were ideas, and for the first time everyone had access to them. Concordia became the tangible test case, a multi-species colony built from the ground up on a marginal world with no pre-existing settlements, no inherited power dynamics, no ancient claims to the land. The soil was neutral. The atmosphere was impartial. The only history was the one they chose to write together. The charter was simple: a direct democracy for local matters, a rotating council for planetary governance, mutual defense, shared resources. It was the Accord in miniature, a living experiment. Humans, Drathel, Gaviks, Traxians, all living and working side by side. The initial settlements were tense. Suspicion was the default setting. Housing blocks were integrated by design. Work assignments were mixed. A Drathel structural engineer might report to a Gaviks project lead. A human hydroponics specialist might train a Traxian technician. The rules were clear. No violence, no threats, respect for all customs that did not infringe on the rights of others. Disputes went to mediation, not duels. It was awkward. It was frustrating. It was progress measured in tiny incremental gestures, an experiment in shared governance and mutual respect. The first planetary vote was a mess. Different species had different concepts of time, of debate, of decision-making. The Drathel expected swift top-down orders. The Gaviks favored long, consensus-building discussions. The humans kept trying to form committees. The Traxians just wanted to get the work done. They had to invent a new process from scratch. They had to listen. They had to compromise. It was the most difficult engineering project on the planet. They were building a society. Bexor, a once feared overlord, participated. His name had been on targeting lists. He had commanded fleets. Now he was a colonist, a volunteer. His transformation was not sudden. It was gradual, reluctant, then curious. He was assigned to the agricultural sector. He went from conqueror to cultivator. He learned about soil pH and irrigation cycles. His famed tactical mind, once used to calculate fleet deployments, was now applied to predicting harvest yields and optimizing water usage. He planted tubers. He spent his days in the sun, his copper hands buried in the dirt. He gardened alongside former enemies, a Gaviks woman whose homeworld he had once bombarded from orbit, taught him about companion planting. They did not talk about the past. They talked about pests and nutrients and the best way to support a growing vine. The work was quiet, methodical. It had a clear, visible result. A row of plants. A successful harvest. It was the opposite of command. There was no subjugation, only cooperation with the land and each other. His admission came during a routine psych evaluation. It was not dramatic. He said it quietly, almost to himself. I sleep better now. The interviewer waited. Bexor looked at his hands, the soil still under his nails. The sleep is different. There are no calculations, no fleet movements behind my eyes. Just the sun on the soil, the pattern of the rows. It was the most profound statement of peace ever uttered by a Drathel. It was not about power. It was about rest. Transformation required effort, not annihilation. It demanded daily mundane work, showing up, doing the job, talking to your neighbor, pulling the weeds. Power redefined as positive contribution proved a stronger glue than fear. Your value was not what you could take. It was what you could add to the community. A good harvest fed everyone. A repaired generator kept the lights on for all. This created a shared stake in each other's success. Fear isolates. Contribution connects. It was a model. Imperfect but working. Fights still happened. Prejudices simmered. Old hatreds flared on bad days. But the structure held. The systems they built together, the shared mess halls, the joint schools for the children, the community gardens, created a web of connections that was stronger than the memories of old conflicts. Concordia did not prove that different species could live in perfect harmony. It proved they could choose to build a functional society despite their differences. It was not a utopia. It was a blueprint. A messy, difficult, ongoing proof of concept for the entire galaxy. A decade after the sundering of the old empire, the Galactic Accord was formalized. It was not a treaty. It was not a surrender document. It was a cooperative framework for 12,000 sovereign worlds. Each member retained its independence, its local laws, its unique culture. But all were now bound to a common set of rules, a shared code of conduct for a fractured galaxy, trying to become a community. The signing ceremony took place on Nexus Station. The main concourse was packed with delegates from species once separated by light years and millennia of animosity. The air hummed with 100 different languages. The document itself was projected overhead, a complex web of articles and clauses written in clear, uncompromising galactic standard. The core tenets were simple, brutally simple: no slavery in any form, no conquest, no weapons designed for planetary destruction, mutual defense against any external threat, free trade across all member systems. These were not suggestions. They were the foundation, the non-negotiable pillars. The Articles of Foundation, they were called. They were a direct refutation of everything the Drathel Empire had stood for. They replaced a system of enforced hierarchy with a network of mutual obligation. The tension in the room was not about whether to sign. It was about living up to what they were signing. Could a former slave species trust a former master to abide by these rules? Could a warlord culture learn to resolve a border dispute in a courtroom instead of a battlefield? The agreement was a leap of faith for everyone. The framework was durable precisely because it acknowledged its own imperfection. It did not promise utopia. It built a system to manage imperfection. Border disputes still flared. Occasional acts of piracy or localized violence occurred. Old hatreds did not vanish overnight. The Accord did not prevent conflict. It provided a path through it. A series of escalating diplomatic, economic, and judicial processes designed to de-escalate and resolve. Mediation panels, trade oversight committees, a multi-species judiciary. The goal was not to eliminate disagreement. It was to ensure disagreement didn't end in genocide. The framework endured because it was grounded in shared purpose and continual grinding effort. It was not held together by the coercive force of a central military or a dominant species. There was no galactic police force. Compliance was ensured through mutual interest. A world that violated the core tenets faced economic isolation, loss of trade partners, revocation of mutual defense guarantees. Their own people would feel the consequences first. The pressure to comply came from the network itself, from the interconnected web of relationships and dependencies the Marshall Plan and places like Concordia had built. Your neighbor's security became your security, their prosperity your prosperity. Their instability, your problem. The old hierarchies of domination, the very idea that one species or culture had a natural right to rule over others, were not outlawed. They were not eliminated by decree or military victory. They were made obsolete. They were gradually abandoned, one system at a time by choice. They became inefficient. They offered no advantage in the new network. A culture that insisted on conquest found itself isolated, poor, and vulnerable. A culture that embraced cooperation found trade partners, allies, and security. The galaxy, faced with a clear alternative, looked at the old way and found it lacking. It was a quiet, collective, unspoken decision. The galaxy had looked into the abyss of endless cyclical violence and chosen a different kind of power, the power of a functional system. Ortiz framed the closing insight years later, standing on the observation deck of a station overlooking a thriving multi-species trade hub. The silence around her was the quiet hum of cooperation, not the tense silence of a standoff. Her voice was different now, less the diplomat, more the historian, the philosopher. Choice, she said, the word simple and final in the quiet room. We gave everyone in the galaxy something they'd never truly had before. It wasn't technology. It wasn't safety. It was more fundamental than that. For 12,000 years, destiny was dictated by the strong. Your fate was not your own. It was a calculation made by an overlord on a distant throne. Your future was a line on a resource allocation chart. Your world was a strategic asset or expendable buffer zone. You lived and died by a logic you never agreed to. Your story was written for you, in a language of fear and submission. We broke that cycle, not by becoming the strongest, not by building a bigger empire with a kinder face. We proved that raw strength was never the point. It was a faulty measurement, an outdated tool, the ability to choose their own destiny. That was the gift. That was the core of the entire conflict, reframed. It was a meditation on the true nature of freedom, and its heavier twin, responsibility. Freedom isn't a state of being. It's a continuous act of choosing. It's the burden of deciding what comes next with no one else to blame for the outcome. And that responsibility requires hope. A belief that the effort is worth it, that the choices matter. The final line she offered tied it to a universal truth, something that resonated in every culture, in every language. Hope that tomorrow can be better than today if we choose to make it so. It was not a promise. It was a conditional statement, an if-then equation for civilization. It placed the agency squarely on the present. The future is not something that happens to you. It is something you build hour by hour, choice by choice, with the materials you have and the people beside you. A civilization's greatness is not measured by the height of its monuments or the reach of its fleets. Those are relics of the old way. It is measured by its capacity to imagine a more inclusive, cooperative future, and then its collective will to enact it, to do the hard, unglamorous work of building the systems, having the difficult conversations and making the daily choices that turn that imagination into reality. Their supposed superiority was a cage they had spent 12,000 years building for themselves. A beautiful, gilded, incredibly strong cage with one simple design flaw. The door only locked from the inside. We simply refused to enter it. We stood outside and showed them the bars. In the recording gallery, Zorbent Tuck finally understood this. His stylus hovered over his data slate. His entire life's work was documenting the inevitable triumph of the Drathal will. Now he was recording its unraveling. He watched the Overlords' confusion, their anger giving way to a dawning, horrific realization. They weren't losing a battle. They were becoming irrelevant. He captured the precise moment their ancient, unshakable certainty died. It didn't die in a fiery explosion. It died in a quiet conference room, suffocated by an idea they couldn't comprehend and a weapon they couldn't see. What followed was a standoff measured in cycles, not minutes. Jackson gave a single silent command. The nanites deactivated. On the view screen, the 50 warships flickered back to life. Engines reignited. Systems came online. The crews, presumably confused but alive, began frantic damage assessments. It was a gesture. A calculated show of good faith, but not weakness. The weapon had been demonstrated. Its recall was simply proof of our control over it. The leverage remained. The threat was not gone. It was merely holstered. The humans then offered the Sovereignty Pact. A simple document. It outlined mutual recognition of borders, non-aggression, open diplomatic channels, Basic civilized interaction between two independent powers. It was a chance for the Drathel to step back from the brink they themselves had created, to accept a reality where they were not the sole arbiters of galactic law. For 3 standard cycles, the negotiation continued. It was a tense, grinding dialogue that stretched across long shifts and uncomfortable silences. The conference room became a battleground of a different kind. A war of words and ideas. The human diplomats adapted their arguments in real time. They listened to the Overlords' rigid, recycled dogma about natural order and inherent superiority. And they found the cracks. They asked simple, logical questions the Drathel had never been forced to answer. Why was strength only measured in destructive capability? What was the long-term cost of ruling through fear alone? How did constant conquest constitute a stable, prosperous society? They dissected the imperial philosophy not with anger but with calm, relentless logic. The Overlords, for the first time in their history, were forced to defend their beliefs, to debate, to justify their so-called natural order to someone who did not automatically accept it as truth. They were not equipped for it. Their entire political and social system had no mechanisms for dealing with equals, only superiors and inferiors. Their rhetoric sounded hollow, repetitive, almost childish when stripped of the threat of imminent violence. They had no answers, only assertions. Their confidence began to erode under the steady, patient pressure of reasoned argument. Across the galaxy, the nascent coalition of observer species watched the proceedings through secured data feeds. They saw the impossible unfolding, the unbreakable will breaking. They saw a future they had never dared imagine, a future where the Drathel were not overlords but participants. A future where humanity was teaching the galaxy a new way to think, a new way to resolve conflict. Not by being the biggest predator, but by being the cleverest problem solver. The entire exchange crystallized a single, key insight for everyone watching. Power was not a fixed quantity. It was not a mountain to be climbed and owned. It was a fluid concept. It could be redefined, redistributed, repurposed. Its nature could be changed by a new idea, a new tactic, a new way of seeing the board. Humanity was not seizing the Drathel's power. We were writing an entirely new definition of what power even meant. The 3-cycle pause in hostilities was fragile. It could have shattered at any moment. But it was a pause, a hesitation, a moment of doubt. It was something the Drathel Empire had never in 12,000 years granted to anyone else. The Drathel could not tolerate the uncertainty. The challenge to their identity was a psychological wound they had no capacity to heal. A predator does not negotiate with its prey. The very concept was a violation of their biological and cultural programming. It consumes it. The 3 cycles of strained dialogue were not progress to them. They were an open humiliation, a festering insult that demanded a violent, cleansing response. They needed to reassert the natural order, to feel the familiar satisfaction of dominance. The silence from the humans following the sovereignty offer was profound. No further communications, no diplomatic counterproposals. No threats. This quiet was misread. Completely. The Drathel command structure, conditioned to interpret any pause as regrouping or fear, saw it as weakness. A sign that the human gambit had failed, that their strange, non-violent weapon had been a one-time trick, and now, without a clear next move, they were hesitating. They saw a window, a chance to remind the galaxy and themselves who held the real power. It was an opportunity to erase the shame of the conference room with a classic, overwhelming display of force. They launched a surprise attack on Proxima Centauri B. The colony was a soft target. A relatively new human outpost on a marginal world. It was swift. A single battle group jumped in system, bypassing early warning grids with practiced ease. Orbital bombardment commenced within minutes of arrival. The intent was devastating. This was not a tactical strike. It was a message. A performance of brutality designed for a galaxy-wide audience. Surface installations were vaporized. Communications arrays shattered. The few defensive satellites were swatted aside. They made sure the destruction was visible. They wanted every sensor array for light years around to record it. They celebrated what they called their first victory. Imperial broadcasts hailed the attack as a glorious return to form. The rightful order restored. The brief, confusing interlude of human defiance was over. The Overlords on the high command world watched the footage on repeat. The fiery impacts on the planet's surface, the silent blooms of energy against the blackness of space. This was a language they understood. This was how a superior species dealt with insolence. They congratulated themselves on their decisiveness. They believed they had called humanity's bluff. They had shown the cost of resistance, and now they expected the inevitable collapse. The surrender. The begging for terms. For 3 weeks, humanity remained silent. We let them celebrate. Our comms channels stayed dark. No declarations of war, no cries of outrage, no counterattacks. From the outside, it looked like shock, like a species that had finally been broken. The Drathel command grew more confident with each passing day of quiet. Their scouts reported no fleet movements, no massing of forces, nothing. This confirmed their theory. The humans were spent. Their one clever trick had failed, and they had nothing left. This was the final fatal miscalculation. They believed our silence was surrender. They believed we were licking our wounds, preparing to submit. It was not surrender. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated pause. The choice to respond not as they would, but as we would. We were not gathering ships. We were not building bigger bombs. We were working, analyzing, preparing a response that was not a reflection of their attack, but a negation of its entire premise. We were building something new. On the 22nd day, the silence ended. Not with a declaration of war. Not with a fleet emerging from warp. It ended with a single, powerful, unjammable signal broadcast across the entire galaxy. Every planet. Every ship. Every listening post. The message was not in Drathel. It was in Galactic Standard. A voice began to speak. The silence ended with a signal. The message was not in Drathel. It was in Galactic Standard. A calm, clear voice began to speak, and it spoke to everyone. It did not declare war. It did not issue threats. It declared the Empire's end. Not with a fleet mobilization order, but with a blueprint. A detailed open-source schematic packet followed the audio. It was a clarion call to any species that would listen, an open offer to join a new order. Not an alliance under human leadership. A coalition of mutual defense. A network. The message didn't ask for soldiers. It didn't demand allegiance. It provided tools. The schematics were for defensive systems, point defense grids, early warning sensor arrays, non-invasive jamming fields. The designs were elegant in their simplicity. They could be built and powered with commonly available technology, the kind of industrial base even the most resource-starved, subjugated world possessed. The instructions were clear. The math was solid. The physics worked. It was not a call to attack the Drathel. Attacking them was their game. It was a game they had spent millennia perfecting. They would win that fight every time. This was a call to make their attacks irrelevant. To change the fundamental equation of conflict. The goal wasn't to destroy the predator. It was to build a fence it couldn't break. The overture was to redefine what it meant to defend freedom. Freedom wasn't something you won in a glorious charge. It was something you built system by system, node by node. It was a quiet, persistent act of construction. Ortiz didn't flinch. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't even change her expression. Jackson remained perfectly still beside her, his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't adopt a defensive stance. This was not the reaction of cornered prey. This was the calm of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome. They had inoculated themselves. The humans had breathed a preventative counteragent for weeks prior to the meeting, a tailored antigen that bonded to their lung tissue, creating a biological filter. It was the only reason they were still standing. The air recycling system in their section of the conference room was not just filtering the atmosphere. It was actively introducing a simulation, a live but inert version of the same nanite swarm that now held the Drathel fleet in stasis. The particles were microscopic, odorless, undetectable to Drathel sensors. They filled the space around the human delegation like a faint, invisible mist. They were breathing the weapon that disabled the fleet. Every lungful of air they drew contained a suspended cloud of the very machines that had just demonstrated absolute control over the most powerful warships in the quadrant. It was a calculated, insane gambit, a move of absolute confidence that bordered on madness. It proved we weren't just willing to risk a confrontation, we were willing to exist inside the weapon itself. Our safety depended on a technological and biological failsafe working perfectly. Their safety now depended on our continued safety. The Drathel scrambled back. Their military discipline broke. For the first time, genuine fear was on their faces. It wasn't the anger of a challenged superior. It was the primal terror of a predator that suddenly finds itself trapped in its own trap. They looked at the humans not as enemies to be shot, but as carriers of a contagion. A single order to fire, a single plasma bolt would breach the environmental seals. It would rupture the localized containment field maintaining the nanite cloud's density. The invisible weapon would flood the entire conference room, the command decks, the life support systems of the Drathel flagship itself. The message was surgically clear. Attempt to harm us, and you only harm yourselves. We are not a threat you can eliminate with violence. Violence was their language, their solution to every problem. We had just rewired the grammar. An attack on us would become an attack on their own command structure. The most feared warriors in the galaxy, masters of conquest and destruction, were suddenly vulnerable not to a greater force, but to their own reflexive instincts. They were disarmed by their own methodology. Their weapons were still in their hands, but pulling the trigger had just become an act of suicide. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift, it inverted completely. They were no longer the hunters. They were hostages to their own aggression. Ortiz spoke into the silence her people had created. The air still hummed with the residual charge of plasma rifles and panicked breath. Her voice cut through it, calm, level, unhurried. "We came in peace," she stated, her gaze moving deliberately from one stunned overlord to the next. "And we still prefer peace." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple, factual reminder of their initial position, a position the Drathel had chosen to ignore. Her tone shifted then. Not louder, just harder, more focused. "But we needed you to understand something fundamental about humans." This was the core of it. The reason their entire 12,000-year playbook had just failed. The Drathel had spent millennia perfecting the art of domination. They understood conquest. They understood fear. They understood the psychology of breaking a species' spirit. They measured civilizations by their capacity to inflict damage and their willingness to submit to it. Tenacity to them was a primitive trait, a stubborn animalistic refusal to accept the inevitable, a quirk to be identified, isolated, and crushed under the weight of overwhelming force. We saw it differently. That stubbornness wasn't a flaw. It was our defining characteristic. Our refusal to break was not a last resort. It was our first principle. It was the engine of our history. It was the reason we left our planet, why we built in hostile environments, why we looked at a problem labeled impossible and treated it as an interesting starting point. They saw a wall and built a bigger hammer. We saw a wall and learned to climb it, tunnel under it, or patiently wait for it to erode. Our strength wasn't in our muscles or our missiles. It was in our flexibility, our relentless, frustrating, unkillable adaptability. Ortiz let that truth hang in the nanite-laced air for a moment. She looked directly at the lead overlord, whose copper skin seemed to have lost some of its metallic sheen. "We don't accept ultimatums," she said, her words precise and final. "We don't submit to bullies." The simplicity of the statement was its power. There were no complex treaties outlined, no lists of demands, no legalistic jargon. It was a declaration, a statement of a new galactic fact, delivered not from a position of conquered weakness, but from a position of demonstrated, unassailable control. This was not a negotiation. Negotiation implies a power exchange, a give and take between parties who recognize each other's legitimacy. The Drathel did not recognize our legitimacy. They saw us as subjects. We had just forced them to see us as architects. We had built a new reality in their conference room, and they were now living in it. The terms were not up for debate. The terms were the environment itself. The paralyzed fleet, the weaponized air, the unblinking calm of the delegation. The overlords had no choice. For the first time in their recorded history, they were not the ones dictating terms. They were the ones being presented with a finished product. Their role was reduced to a single humiliating action. They were forced to listen, to process, to accept that the galaxy they thought they owned had just fundamentally changed, and they had not been consulted. They were spectators at the unveiling of their own obsolescence. Why did the Drathel believe we were just another primitive species? Their entire empire was built on a simple, brutal premise, a self-evident truth they never questioned. The strong dominate the weak. It was a cosmic law as fundamental to them as gravity. Their civilization was a monument to this belief, A sprawling hierarchy where every species, every individual, had a designated rung on a ladder of power. Strength was a tangible, measurable thing. They quantified it in the tonnage of their warships, the yield of their planet-cracking warheads, the sheer number of soldiers in their legions. Their power was in the ability to inflict overwhelming, undeniable fear. It was a language everyone understood. Or so they thought. They had no metric for adaptability, no scale for strategic creativity. Their entire culture was built on a foundation of rigid certainty, a meticulously maintained status quo. Evolution for them was a process that had already reached its pinnacle. Them. Improvement meant building a bigger gun, a thicker shield. It never meant questioning the need for the gun in the first place. They failed to see that the most dangerous creature in any ecosystem isn't the strongest or the fastest, or the one with the biggest teeth. It's the one that can adapt the fastest, the one that learns, that changes its behavior, that turns a predator's strength into its weakness. A shark is a perfect predator until the water drains from the tank. We adapted to their rules just enough to learn them. We studied their conquests, their tactics, their psychology. We didn't try to imitate their fleets. We didn't try to build a bigger battleship. We learned the rules of their game so thoroughly that we could see the flaws in the design. Then we didn't break the rules. We changed the game entirely. We moved the playing field. Their blindness, this fundamental lack of imagination, was their greatest vulnerability. Their cultural and technological stagnation became our single biggest advantage. They were a rock, worn smooth by millennia of certainty. We were water, finding every crack, every fissure, every unseen weakness. They expected a fight for dominance. They were prepared for a bloody, glorious war of attrition, a conflict that would reaffirm their place at the top of the food chain. They had rituals for it, ceremonies. Their entire society was primed for that kind of cathartic, validating violence. We never gave it to them. Instead, we started a conversation. A cold, clinical, terrifying conversation about the very nature of dominance itself. We asked questions they had no answers for. What is true control? Is it the power to destroy? Or the power to prevent destruction without ever lifting a weapon? Is a ruler who must constantly enforce their rule through fear ever truly in control? The view screen showed 50 Drathal warships dead in space, their power grids disabled, life support still running. General Jackson stood before the Overlords, a smirk playing on his lips. "We don't accept ultimatums," he said. "We don't submit to bullies." How did humanity turn the galaxy's most feared predators into prisoners in their own conference room? For 12,000 years, the Drathal Empire stood unchallenged. Their rule was absolute, built on a simple, brutal logic. Fear maintained order, conquest expanded territory, and their version of natural law justified both. They moved through the galaxy like a force of nature, inevitable, merciless, final. Every species they encountered faced the same choice: submit completely or be erased. No negotiations. No exceptions. Their warships carried planet-cracking weaponry. Their soldiers were engineered for domination. They were, in every sense, apex predators. Then they found us. Humanity was unlike anything in their records, a blue-green species of stubborn contradictions. We built cities in deserts, sailed oceans we couldn't breathe in, launched probes toward stars we'd never reach. We were misfits, idealists, problem solvers who treated impossibility as a suggestion. The Drathal expected the familiar script: demands, then compliance. They transmitted their terms: tribute and resources, periodic sacrifices, unconditional fealty. Standard procedure. They did not expect Ambassador Daniela Ortiz. She arrived without ceremony, no royal escort, no displays of power, just a small diplomatic vessel and a team of aides. When the four-armed Drathal guards encircled her delegation, she didn't tense. She observed. Their copper skin glinted under the harsh conference lights. The lead overlord delivered the expected speech about natural order. Superior and inferior species, their place at the top. Ours, presumably, somewhere far below. Ortiz listened. Then she spoke. Her first words to the overlords were not of surrender. They were a counter-proposal, calm, unflinching. She spoke of coexistence, not as master and servant but as equals. No subjugation, no tribute. Just civilized interaction between two independent powers. The silence in the room was heavier than gravity. This was the first crack in their 12 millennia-old foundation. Not an attack, not a threat, an idea, one they had no protocol for. In the recording gallery, Archivist Zorbent Tak adjusted his console. His role was to document inevitability, the predictable collapse of another species' will. But now his recorder was capturing something new: debate, possibility. He watched the Overlords' confusion, their hesitation. For the first time, he was not recording an ending. He was witnessing a beginning. The Drathel response came exactly as projected, predictable, almost tedious. The lead Overlord's voice didn't even shift in tone. "The galaxy has an order," he stated, a fact as undeniable as gravity. "We are at the top. You are not." The terms were the same ones given to 1,000 species before us: submit, or be annihilated. No counterproposals. No debate. The four-armed guards tightened their circle around the human delegation. Their movements were synchronized, a well-practiced display of controlled threat. Their copper skin caught the harsh conference room lights glinting like polished metal. This was the moment, the point of no return in their script, the moment where fear was supposed to overwhelm reason, where the weight of their empire crushed the will to resist. Every other species had broken here. They surrendered their sovereignty, their resources, their people. They accepted their place in the Drathel hierarchy. General Leo Jackson did not break. He didn't even flinch. He remained perfectly still at Ortiz's side, his expression a mask of calm assessment. He had waited for this precise instant. He had calculated the psychological peak of their arrogance, the exact second when they believed their victory was absolute and our defeat inevitable. The Overlords watched him, expecting the familiar signs of collapse, the lowered eyes, the slumped shoulders, the stuttered acquiescence. They saw none of it. They believed they held all the power in that room. They believed their warships hovering at the edge of our system were the ultimate argument. They were wrong. Jackson's hand moved. A subtle gesture, a tap on his wrist console. No dramatic flourish. The holographic projector in the center of the table flickered to life. The Overlords fell silent, their focus shifting from the humans to the shimmering light. The projection showed space, their fleet. 50 Drathel warships hung motionless against the starfield. No engine glow, no weapon ports active, no movement. They were dead in the void. Status readouts scrolled alongside each vessel. A cascade of red failure warnings. Power grids disabled. Primary and secondary systems offline. Communications silent. But one line of data remained stubbornly green on every single ship. Life support. Still running. Crews alive, trapped inside impotent metal shells. This was not an act of destruction. It was a demonstration of control. An exhibit of perfect surgical precision. We hadn't fired a single shot. We hadn't tried to match their brute force. We had simply paused them. The first move was made without a declaration of war. The board wasn't just reset. It was flipped. The game they thought they were playing no longer existed. How do you disable a warship without firing a shot? The Drathel technology was clearly superior on every conventional metric. Their shields could absorb sustained barrages from planet-killer class weapons. Their own armaments could reduce continents to molten glass in a single salvo. Their sensors tracked objects across light years. In a straight fight, fleet against fleet, we stood no chance. The outcome was mathematically certain, so we didn't try. We attacked the one thing they never thought to shield because they considered it beneath notice: the power grid. Not the glamorous weapons or the imposing engines, just the quiet, humming infrastructure that everything else depended on. We targeted the mundane, the necessary, the overlooked nanites, microscopic machines, each no larger than a dust mote. They weren't weapons. They were tools, designed for one purpose: infiltrate and disrupt. Their programming was simple: find power conduits, find control nodes, execute a cascading shutdown sequence, then go dormant. They were the antithesis of a Drathel warhead: silent, subtle, surgical. We didn't hack their systems. We didn't break their encryptions. That was their expectation. Their entire security paradigm was built around repelling digital assaults and kinetic impacts. They never considered a physical infiltrator so small it could ride in on the solar wind. Slipping through external sensor grids they considered secure. The nanites moved like a ghost through a wall, bypassing every alarm. They infiltrated maintenance ducts. They traveled along energy flows. They embedded themselves in systems that had never known a foreign object. The Overlords in the conference room stared at the holographic display of their paralyzed fleet. They saw the impossible. Their ships were not torn apart by explosions. They weren't drifting wrecks. They were just still, perfectly intact, utterly silent, held in a silent, perfect stasis. The crews were alive, unharmed, but trapped inside technological tombs of their own making. The readouts showed all systems in standby. Weapons offline. Engines cold. Communications dead. Only life support remained, a deliberate choice on our part. A message in itself. This was our advantage. Not bigger guns. Not thicker armor. Smarter tactics. A fundamental shift in the definition of conflict. We didn't meet their strength with strength. We adapted to their weakness. Adaptability triumphing over raw, stagnant might. Dr. Tanaka, our lead systems analyst, explained it to them. Her voice was calm, clinical, almost apologetic. She described the nanites not as a weapon, but as a systemic countermeasure. She called it a non-destructive neutralization protocol. She outlined how they targeted redundancy systems first, preventing backup power from coming online. How they created a cascading failure that looked, to their engineers, like a catastrophic series of internal malfunctions. It was a lesson in forced humility for a species of apex predators. They were masters of the sledgehammer. We had just introduced them to the scalpel. Their entire concept of warfare was based on visible, measurable destruction. We showed them that true control requires no destruction at all, just a thorough understanding of the system you wish to control and the creativity to redefine the terms of engagement. Then came the second reveal, the truly terrifying one. Chaos erupted in the conference room. The Overlords' composure shattered. They pushed back from the table. Guards raised their weapons, a forest of plasma rifles now targeting the human delegation. Fingers rested on triggers. Standard procedure dictated immediate termination of the threat. The air grew thick with the hum of charging energy cells. Everyone waited for the first shot.